Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of Mr. Mackenzie's Distance Learning, the Move to Global War, International Response to the Growing Aggression of both Italy and Germany. Let's begin now. First, we're going to look at Great Britain. What was their response to the growing aggression of Italy and Germany? Well, we're going to kind of mainly focus on Germany at this point. And we're going to start with the appeasement policy. The appeasement policy that the British were taking with countries like Italy and particularly Germany. Now we should know what appeasement means. Appeasement is kind of like to give in to demands, to soothe someone's egos, to avoid war at all costs. That is really what appeasement is going to be trying to do here. We have to remember that this is the 1930s. World War I, although not really fresh in people's mind, was a memory that people remembered living through the times of World War I and don't want to have a costly war. So appeasement was an attempt to give in a little bit to some demands in the grander hope of avoiding war. We're going to look at 6 reasons why the British, under the leadership of Neville Chamberlain, who you can see there shaking the hand of Adolf Hitler, really went for this appeasement policy. So the first reason is public opinion. We know that these democracies like the United States, France, and Great Britain, these are democracies where the leaders are voted in by public opinion. It's going to be a hard sell to the public opinion to go to war again because Germany wants to rearm the Rhineland, or Germany wants the Sudetenland, which has German-speaking people in it, or let's go to war because Germany wants to have a political union with Austria. It's a hard sell to the public to get behind this. Number 2, Hitler's demands seemed justified. Again, we've gone a little bit, it's been a while since World War I, almost a full generation, a good 20 years. By the time that appeasement is happening, we're looking at 1937, 1938. That's a good 20 years since the end of World War I, and it seems like Hitler's demands seemed justified. The Rhineland, put more German soldiers in a part of Germany, doesn't seem too out of the question. A political union with Austria that has this kind of shared cultural heritage to Germany doesn't seem too crazy an idea. To regain the Sudetenland, which was full of German-speaking people anyways. So to nations like Britain, his demands didn't seem too far-fetched, at least not worth going to war over. No strong alternative. Appeasement at this time was the best choice. Okay, they don't have the benefit of hindsight. They don't know that Hitler's word is not worth anything. They don't know that he's eventually going to take over all of Czechoslovakia, that they're eventually going to invade into Poland and invade Denmark. They don't know this. At this time, in the late 30s, 1938, appeasement seemed the best option. Diplomacy and avoiding war. Yes, they had to give in a little bit to Adolf Hitler, but it seemed the overall goal was to avoid a very big, horrific, costly war. So appeasement would work and work and work until it didn't work all of a sudden. The Great Depression. Okay, the Great Depression. We have to remember that we are still in the grips of the Great Depression. The mid-30s, late 30s, countries are still dealing with the Great Depression. Britain is suffering its own economic woes at home. So when these things happen, countries become a little more self-interested, worrying about themselves, and not really worried about stationing soldiers in the Rhineland to protect their foreign interests. They're worried about their own nation. The empire. So not only does Britain really have to worry about just its own nation, it has to worry about all of this empire. Remember our saying from class, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, anywhere that sun is beating down on, that the British own, they have to worry about them. So they're not really too concerned with Germany wanting to annex Austria, or Germany wanting to place more German soldiers in another area of Germany, like the Rhineland. They're worried about their own interests in their empire. Chamberlain is influential at this time. Okay, he wasn't about to sell to the British public that any of these reasons were worth going to war again, and it seemed like appeasement was the best option. Unfortunately, this is all going to fall down. It's going to come crashing down onto Neville Chamberlain's shoulders here, because we'll eventually learn that Hitler's word when he signs treaties is worthless, that he's going to go against everything he signs and all the treaties he agrees to. Hitler's going to go against this. So it is really going to blow up in Chamberlain's face, but we don't know that at this point, right? We don't have that hindsight if we're living during this time. We don't know that Hitler's going to go against all of his promises. We can talk real shortly about France as well. Obviously, France is very threatened by Germany. They always have been. They have long tensions since the Franco-Prussian War. Most of World War I, the Western Front, was fought on French soil. They still feel very suspicious and very threatened by Germany. They don't like the fact that they're looking to rearm and remilitarize the Rhineland, building up their army, building up their air force. They don't like the idea of them annexing or having an Anschluss with Austria. It's going to make that petite entente that France has with smaller countries over in Eastern Europe difficult to maintain. But sadly, France isn't strong enough to do it on their own. If they want to step up and kind of put Germany in its place, they really need Britain to do that. And if the British aren't willing to support France in this endeavor, then France is kind of out of luck. So they're really, unless they're willing to do it on their own, which they're not, they can't do it. One thing that we can say about the French, yes, they feel threatened by Germany. They want to kind of put Germany in its place. They can't kind of bring the fight to Germany because they're not backed by the British. So France is really taking defensive measures against Germany. They will be building up what's known as the Maginot Line. We're going to talk about that when we get into World War II. But they're really preparing themselves for a defensive war that in their mind is around the corner. They know that war with Germany in the next few years is a likely outcome. So they're preparing defensive measures, a Maginot Line, because they know from their history that Germany will most likely bring the fight to them. The League of Nations. So what is the League of Nations' response to this growing aggression against both Italy and Germany? We'll talk about both. We know we've talked at great length about the League of Nations and why they were weak. We know that they are ineffective. We know that they lack economic and the military power of the United States. The United States never joined the League of Nations, so they don't really have that economic and military might. And if the League of Nations is setting sanctions against countries like Japan, Italy, or Germany, the United States is not bound by those sanctions. So, the League of Nations tells other member nations not to have trade or to ship over any wartime goods or war material to these countries. The United States can still step in and continue trade with Italy or continue trade with Germany, which is what happens. And time again, we've seen how the League of Nations becomes ineffectual, becomes very weak. We saw their reaction to the Manchurian crisis when Japan invaded and took over Manchuria. We saw their response that was fairly weak to when Japan invaded mainland China and started bombing those coastal cities of Beijing and Shanghai. We saw another weak response to the Abyssinia crisis when Italy invades Ethiopia, Abyssinia. So time and time again, the League of Nations, which is really led by the British and the French to a lesser extent, are proving themselves fairly weak and ineffectual on the world stage. The United States, what is their response to this growing aggression? Well, we know these kind of intermittent war years. The United States is enjoying isolationism, at least militarily. Economically, they are still doing commerce and business with all sorts of different nations. They are not bound by sanctions put in place by the League of Nations. Militarily, they are not getting involved. 1935, the United States passes neutrality pacts stating that they will not be getting involved with nations that are at war. So it's really taking the United States out of this fight. Let Europe deal with Europe's problem. Let the Pacific or Asia deal with things on their own. The United States isn't getting involved. Eventually, we do see how the United States eventually does get involved. We talked about that with their international response to Japan. We know that once the United States is directly hit, we see there the attack of Pearl Harbor, that the United States declares war and gets in on World War II. Okay, the Soviet Union. We haven't really talked about them much until this point. We will be talking about them a lot going forward. We'll definitely be talking about them a lot with our look at World War II. We should know this guy right here, Joseph Stalin. What are some things we know about him? Well, we should know that he's a very paranoid leader. Mistrusts everyone. Politically, militarily, his own people. He's very paranoid. We're going to see through World War II that even though he's going to be on the same side as the Allies, the British and the Americans, that even though they're on the same side, he's still going to have a great mistrust to these Western powers. He's not a fan of Hitler. Okay, like fascism, Nazism is at a great odds with communism. We saw a few excerpts from Mein Kampf where Hitler really used communism as his political enemy. So we know Stalin is not a fan of Hitler, but he does feel that a bigger threat were those Western powers. And that suspicion and paranoia will continue into World War II when they find themselves on the same side. The Soviet Union with the British and the Americans. We will even see at one point Hitler and Stalin signing a pact of non-aggression, the non-aggression Nazi-Soviet pact. Here we have a political cartoon. The message is pretty clear here. Two people that make doubtful friends. Sure, they're shaking hands over Poland, like they've agreed to Poland that they're both going to go in and take over parts of it, but they got their hands behind their back with their fingers crossed, meaning they don't really mean what they mean when they shake hands, that they're going to break those promises. So Stalin, not a big fan of Hitler, but they'll be friends for a little while so they can take over parts of Eastern Europe. Stalin is also threatened and suspicious of the Western powers, probably more so at this point. The Soviet Union, I mean, here's really why we see Stalin and the Soviet Union not having a lot of trust in these Western powers of Britain and France in particular. The Soviet Union was not a part of the League of Nations. They were not allowed to be a member of this League of Nations. They eventually joined, I believe around 1934-ish. You have to check that, fact check that. So for about 14 years since the League of Nations was created, the Soviet Union was not allowed to be a member. The Locarno treaties, that spirit of internationalism, the Soviet Union is not there, not invited to the table. The Munich Conference, 1938, the Soviet Union is not invited. So they're really kind of kept off into the sidelines. A lot of mistrust with communism, a lot of mistrust with Stalin. They are not invited to these international treaties and conferences. The political cartoon, we see kind of depicting the Munich conference here. We have Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, the British, the French premier, and Mussolini sitting there, all kind of talking around the globe. And off in the doorway, we have Joseph Stalin there. What? No chair for me? How come I'm not invited? And you can really see the differences between the Western powers of Britain and France compared to their more aggressive nations of Germany and Italy. Okay, Neville, our two Western nations here of Britain and France kind of have their shoulders slumped over. They're the ones who are actually acknowledging and looking over at Stalin. They look a little kind of sorry, whereas the body language of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini have their arms crossed, their backs up, not even paying attention to Joseph Stalin, really saying that we're not even going to listen or pay attention to the Soviet Union right now. So in 1935, the British and the Germans signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. This is really to avoid a costly arms race, much like the one we did see right before the start of World War I, that naval arms race that really built up that sense of militarism and suspicion among Germany and Britain that eventually kind of explodes when we see World War I happening. In 1935, Britain and Germany signed a naval agreement to really avoid this from happening again. Britain will allow Germany to build 35% of that of the British fleet. Now, if you guys remember, we did talk about the Washington Naval Conference back in the 1920s and how much each nation was allowed to have. We talked about the 5-5-3 treaty, where the British and the United States were the fives. We saw France at 3, Japan at 3, Italy at 1.75, and then France at 1.75. Germany is at 0. Germany is not allowed to have any big navy. Remember, one of those terms of the Treaty of Versailles, there have no subs, there have small ships, no big battleships. So some of those strict terms of the Treaty of Versailles saying that Germany could not have a big navy seems like they're starting to kind of pull the strings away from that a little bit. 1935, it seems the British is now allowing Germany to have 35% of what the British fleet has. Let's look at this propaganda newspaper cartoon. The boy who shouldn't grow up. John Bull, the big figure there on the right, the fictional British character. There's your new navy suit. Now you must promise me you won't grow out of it. Germany. Well, at all events, I'll promise not to unless you grow out of yours. So the thing is, if you go bigger, we're going to keep getting bigger, okay? Because they're allowed to be 35% of that. So here we have our first kind of sign that the Treaty of Versailles and those terms are starting to be picked away at. And we're starting to see appeasement being used here, giving in to Germany. Okay, they weren't allowed to have a navy, not allowed to have subs. Let's give them a navy. Let's allow them to have submarines. So they're appeasing Germany now. Okay, let's talk about the Abyssinia crisis. What was the international response to the Abyssinia conference? What was the League of Nations response? Well, we know it was pretty weak, and they do what they do best. They condemn the actions and wave their finger, and they're going to probably put on economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are given to Italy for this takeover of Abyssinia. But what's the problem with this? What's the problem with just kind of putting on economic sanctions? Well, ultimately, member nations really can choose if they want to listen to this or not. And a lot of member nations might feel that the why bother listening to the League of Nations anymore and continue on with trade with Italy? The United States is not bound by these economic sanctions, and they can continue having trade with Italy. It should also be noted that the League of Nations is kind of run by Britain and France. They're the main countries that are leading the League of Nations. But as that's happening, we also have the Laval Pact, a pact between a British official and a French official. You can see them kind of sitting with their backs on this piece of paper that says Abyssinia. The Laval Pact was made by the British and the French that pretty much allowed Italy to take over much of Abyssinia. So on one hand, you have the League of Nations, that's pretty much led by the British and the French, placing economic sanctions and saying, how dare you, Italy, at this invasion of Abyssinia. Meanwhile, you have some of their officials, Laval, making a pact allowing Italy to take over much of Abyssinia. So we have another instance where we see appeasement. That Laval Pact was very much appeasement to Italy. They are giving over Abyssinia, that power, over to Italy. Okay, let's talk about the Rhineland. So what's the response to the Rhineland? Obviously, according to the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland was to be demilitarized. Now, the Rhineland is a part of Germany. This is a German territory. Now, when the Great Depression is in full swing, the British, the French, and even the Belgians withdraw a lot of their standing army that was stationed in the Rhineland to make sure that it remained demilitarized. But now we see kind of in the mid to late 30s, Germany is going to start to militarize the Rhineland, and that is going to go against the Treaty of Versailles. But ultimately, is this really worth going to war over? Is this worth invading Germany over? Should the British and French, declare war on Germany? What would the reasoning be? Because Germans are putting German soldiers in a part of Germany, that's going to be a hard sell to the public of Great Britain and France. Now, ultimately, this is one of those tricky things. They probably could have done it. At this point in time, the British and the French had maybe a stronger army than Germany. And if they had stepped in and used some of their military and put Germany in their place, maybe the whole course of World War II is offset. But at that moment, they don't know that this is all going to spiral out of control. It's a hard sell to these Western publics that this is worth going to war over, because Germany is putting German soldiers in another part of Germany. So again, we see appeasement happening. Even if France wanted to do it, they needed the support of Britain to make it happen, and they don't have it. If we look at the political cartoon here, obviously we see the big German soldier there kind of putting the squeeze and leaning on these smaller European nations with this increasing pressure. But to the countries that are off to the side, like France and Britain they're not really feeling the full pressure there. So they don't really feel that they need to get involved too quickly. The Spanish Civil War. We're going to go into great detail about the Spanish Civil War after we finish our case studies. But we're really going to see how the Spanish Civil War really does show nations like Britain and France that war really should be avoided. This is really foreshadowing how World War II is going to be fought. The Spanish Civil War is really like the testing ground for World War II. And with Britain and France kind of watching from afar, they're going to see what modern warfare looks like, and that avoiding war is probably their best option. With the Spanish Civil War, we know that foreign nations get involved. We know that the Italians, the Germans, and the Soviet Union are going to get involved. Now, with any kind of civil war that you look at, there's always two factions. Okay, you have one side that supports the standing government in support of that republic, and then you have another side that is the rebels. The people are trying to rebel against that standing government. So you have Italy and Germany, two foreign nations getting involved on the nationalist side, supporting the rebels who are trying to overtake the standing government of Spain. We also have the Soviet Union getting involved. They're going to support the Republican government. So we have all these foreign nations getting involved. Mussolini and Hitler are going to donate manpower, an air force, ammunition, and tanks. The Soviet Union will also volunteer soldiers and ammunition and tanks as well. And from all the destruction of the 3 years that this war plays out, it's really showing the British and the French that war should be avoided. That if they can appease and come to a negotiation and avoid war, it's probably for the best interests of the nations involved. Okay, Anschluss, the political union with Germany and Austria. This was a big no-no against the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France will protest this Anschluss because Hitler wants Austria. They're going to annex Austria and kind of bring it into its greater Germany. Britain and France will protest this. This goes against the Treaty of Versailles. You shouldn't be doing this. But ultimately, we don't see any action. Okay, why don't we see any action? Why don't they kind of roll out their army to put Germany in its place here? Well, for instance, the Austrians aren't putting up a fight. So if the Austrians don't seem to be putting up much of a fight, really, why should the British and the French be putting up a huge fight against this? Or sending in their military to protect an Austria that doesn't seem to want it. Also, if you know geographically speaking what Austria is, they're landlocked. And we know the British have a very good navy, world's best navy. But that does little good to go to Austria that is landlocked. So they're in trouble. France has an army, but now you got to kind of march through Germany or over the mountain range of the Alps to get there to help, and that's going to be trouble. So ultimately, they can protest and say that Hitler is going against the Treaty of Versailles, but there is no action. The Austrians aren't putting up a fight. The British Navy can't really do any good against a nation of Austria that's landlocked, and the French can't do it without the British. Here we have a political cartoon of Adolf Hitler, who looks like Father Christmas, like our Santa Claus here, but instead of giving gifts that Santa Claus is known for, Adolf Hitler is taking gifts. And so instead of bringing gifts for the little children, Hitler is stealing or kidnapping the little children representing the smaller nations of Europe. Right? He's grabbing them and putting them in his sack. Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania. Okay? So he's like this opposite Santa Claus that is stealing instead of giving. Okay, Czechoslovakia. Let's talk about Czechoslovakia and what was the response to this. We know that at the Munich conference in 1938, the Sudetenland was given to Germany. Why? What is so significant about the Sudetenland that is going to allow these nations to give it over to Germany? Well, the fact that it's mainly German-speaking people living there anyways made it pretty easy. We have to remember after the ending of World War I, when the political boundaries of Germany were redrawn, a lot of German people now found themselves living outside of Germany. And they find themselves in this new country, Czechoslovakia. So they are in what's known as the Sudetenland. One of Hitler's goals, pan-Germanism, greater Germany, to bring all of Germany back together. That's what he wanted. So here we see appeasement at its finest. Okay, Britain and France don't mind giving up the Sudetenland to Germany because it's mainly German-speaking people there anyways. What could go wrong? If we're going to give Hitler a little bit, we'll also get his promise that he's not going to take things further. So at the Munich conference, the Sudetenland, that area of Czechoslovakia, was given to Hitler. You can see on the map where that area of the Sudetenland was. Other parts were given to Hungary. A small little part was annexed to Poland. But you know who's not at the discussions here at the Munich conference? What countries aren't there? Well, Czechoslovakia is not at the Munich conference. They don't get a say in any of this. It's basically, get on board with this, Czechoslovakia, or deal with Germany all on your own. The Soviet Union is not invited to the Munich conference as well. So we have a appeasement at its finest here. We see Neville Chamberlain in particular making sure that Germany is kind of, their ego is soothed with the promise that they're not going to take all of Czechoslovakia. So it seemed like a good cost to avoid war. We gave the Germans Sudetenland. We've avoided a war. Right? This is a good day for democracies. And look how happy they are. Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler right there, the best of friends. So it's at the Munich conference that Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler signed the Anglo-German Declaration. It discusses international matters, that the two countries will discuss international matters, and this won't result to war. This seemed like they've avoided war, and Chamberlain returns from the Munich conference. He comes back to England. He's greeted to cheering fans at the airport in London. He declares, "Peace in our time." I have Hitler's signature on this piece of paper where he promises to not take over any more countries. We've given him a little. We've soothed his ego. And we have his promise that he's not going to take over anymore. Now, ultimately, this is going to blow up in Chamberlain's face, because by March of 1939, Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia and takes it over anyways. Now, Mussolini is seeing all of this. He sees, Hitler promised that he wouldn't go any further, and then he went against his promise and took over all of Czechoslovakia. So Mussolini says, when in Rome, because he lives in Rome, he's going to do the same thing. And he's going to take over all of Albania. Remember, we talked about Albania before when we looked at our case study with Italy. So now he's going to go over, and he sees Hitler kind of getting away with this. Why can't Mussolini do the same? Poland. The British tell the Polish, they have a treaty with Poland. We got your back. If you are invaded, we will come to your aid. We will help you. If you are invaded, we will go to war. August of 1939, Hitler and Stalin will sign a very public Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. That the two countries will be friendly and not go to war with each other. And in private, they basically say, we can both go in and take over what we want of Poland. Our political cartoon here saying someone is taking someone for a walk. Our three-legged race here. Yes, they're tied together now with this non-aggression pact, but there's certainly a lot of mistrust between the two. We see their arms are around their backs almost as if a good kind of stranglehold on their necks, and they're each holding guns behind their back, showing that their true nature was mistrust and eventual war between communism and Nazism, but for now, they're bound together with this Nazi-Soviet pact. And they're going to go in and both take over what they want of Poland. But Poland has the reassurance of Britain that they have their back, so we'll see what happens with that. By September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. September 3rd, 1939, the British and the French declare war on Germany, and World War II has begun. Finally, enough had been enough. We clearly see that the appeasement policy of the British did not work. They allowed the remilitarization of the Rhineland. They allowed Anschluss with Austria. They allowed Germany to take over all of Czechoslovakia. Enough was enough, and by the time that Germany invades into Poland, Britain had already said that they would have their back and go to war. So when that happens, Britain declares war. But as we're going to see when we look into our slides and our lectures on World War II, that for many months at the beginning of World War II, nothing much is happening. We get what's known as the phony war. Yes, Britain declares war on Germany, but nothing much is happening. Because it's very hard for Britain to get to Poland to help. Germany has a fantastic, world-class navy, but now has to call up its military and its army now, and it's hard to get to Poland. Are they going to march right through Germany to get to Poland to help Poland? That's going to be very difficult. So we get what's known as the phony war at the beginning of World War II. So that's where we're going to stop. We've looked at our case studies now. We talked about Japan, we talked about Italy, and we talked about Germany, and we've seen the international response from the British, the French, the League of Nations, the United States, and to some extent, the Soviet Union. We're going to stop there. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.